Back in 2017, the United Nations produced what they called the Sustainable Development Goals. They told us that they're the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. They address the global challenges we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace and justice. The 17 goals are all interconnected, and in order to leave no one behind, it's important that we achieve them all by 2030. But in a special report published this month, the UN's own Secretary General Antonio Guterres conceded that the current global pandemic and lockdowns have had a major effect on the world's chances of achieving that target, with health systems overwhelmed, businesses shut down, and 1.6 billion students kept out of school. The buzz phrase we're all hearing in the press and social media these days is the Green Recovery Plan. Just about every major organisation involved in energy and climate issues has produced some kind of report in the last few weeks, outlining what they regard as the top priorities that our corporations and world leaders should be focusing on. So will these green recovery proposals actually translate into tangible concrete actions to bring about a more sustainable and equitable world as we stumble out of the current global health crisis? Or are we destined to rush headlong back to business as usual as quickly as possible? Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think. There's no doubt that the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are an extremely ambitious set of aspirations. Some say they're too ambitious and that we've never had any chance of achieving them by 2030. But they do provide a clear indication of the size of our global challenge over the next decade or so. Our current global greenhouse gas emissions split down like this, and each of the SDGs will be impacted by the strategies our world leaders put in place to reduce those emissions and implement more sustainable and equitable infrastructure. As this chart produced in 2020 by the website Our World in Data shows, global food and agriculture industries are responsible for 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions and 50% of all habitable land on the planet. 94% of all mammalian biomass is livestock for human consumption. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization this week published its 2020 annual report on the state of food security and nutrition around the world, a report known as SOFI 2020, and it makes for pretty grim reading. Current estimates are that nearly 9% of world population, or about 690 million people, are hungry. That figure has increased by 10 million people in 1 year and by nearly 60 million in 5 years. In 2019, close to 750 million, or nearly 1 in 10 people in the world, were exposed to severe levels of food insecurity. An estimated 2 billion people in the world didn't have regular access to safe, nutritious and sufficient food in 2019, and the report echoes Antonio Guterres' earlier warnings, pointing out that the world is not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of zero hunger by 2030. In fact, on recent trends, far from reaching zero, the number would actually increase to 840 million people by 2030, and Africa is on track to see the biggest increase. Under current food consumption patterns, diet-related health costs are projected to exceed $1.3 trillion per year by 2030. On top of that, the diet-related social cost of greenhouse gas emissions associated with current dietary patterns is estimated to be more than $1.7 trillion per year by 2030. The report goes into a great deal more detail, of course, but it essentially concludes that the cost of nutritious foods must come down drastically, and countries will need to rebalance their agricultural policies and subsidies towards better nutritional foods rather than just bulky staple foods full of starch. And that means massive transformations in deeply embedded global food and agricultural systems. But Herculean though that task will be, it'll be no more difficult than the challenge of rapidly bringing down carbon emissions from the energy and transport sectors. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, is now fully partnered with the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA. Both organisations published green recovery reports in June, with IRENA providing data and strategy to meet the overall 2030 carbon reduction targets. The full details outlined in their 144-page paper are outside the scope of this video, of course, but the main highlights are these. In 2019, renewables and other transition-related technologies attracted investments worth $824 billion. That needs to double to almost $2 trillion a year between 2021 and 2023. By 2030, the annual investment needs to have grown to $4.5 trillion. ERRATA say that government funds can leverage private investments by a factor of 3 or 4 and should be used strategically to nudge investment decisions and financing in the right direction. ERRATA argues that the pandemic has sharpened investor interest in sustainable assets. By aligning those investment portfolios to a climate-safe future, those funds will be better prepared for new regulations and fiduciary standards. The report analysts calculate that their proposed transition strategies would achieve net job gains in all regions of the world, including those where fossil fuel jobs are now concentrated. But this relies on improving local industrial capacity and supply chains and implementing comprehensive education and training programs. Investments starting now can put renewable power generation on track to grow 5 times faster than current plans would indicate, and that means substantial upfront spending, says ERRATA, and a re-evaluation of the cost effectiveness of existing assets. For example, their latest cost analysis shows that replacing the least competitive 500 gigawatts of coal-fired power capacity with utility-scale solar PV and onshore wind could reduce annual electricity generation costs by $23 billion every year. The report highlights the distinct lack of ambition in renewable power targets included in the nationally determined contributions that nations set out as part of the 2015 Paris Agreement. ERRATA says that if renewable power continues to grow at the same rate as it did between 2015 and 2018, then cumulative global renewable power targets currently in place for 2030 will be met by 2022. When all those nations meet up again at COP26 in Glasgow next year, there should be an expectation that their nationally determined contributions will have been massively ramped up, especially by the heaviest greenhouse gas emitting countries. But ERRATA also points out that the best way to reduce emissions is to use less energy in the first place, and the building sector will play a key role in this transition. The solutions are varied here, ranging from simple things like LED lamps and more efficient appliances, through to heat pumps and smart home systems, and all the way up to large capital expenditures on full efficiency-orientated retrofits of existing building shells. According to ERRATA's research, there needs to be $2.2 trillion per year of global investment in the building sector, and $2.1 trillion of that will be in energy efficiency. Overall, the building sector represents almost half of the total investment required for the energy transition. Far-sighted corporations and entrepreneurs are now seeing the enormous investment potential of these transition technologies and strategies. Capital is flooding out of the fossil fuel industry right now as investors increasingly fear the risk of stranded assets over the coming years. In a new analysis published in June by the London-based financial think tank Carbon Tracker, they warn that declining demand and rising investment risk due to cheaper renewable technologies, aggressive government policies and the coronavirus pandemic could cause a $25 trillion collapse in future fossil fuel profits. So there's probably never going to be a better time to jump out of oil and gas and jump into wind and solar. But the pandemic has also shown us very clearly that the only way to safely move whole societies from one life support mechanism to another without even more catastrophic consequences is through the injection of extensive and unprecedented levels of financial and policy support from government. Some governments have already responded with green recovery policy announcements. Others are still debating the best economic strategy for their country. The US election in November 2020 may bring about a change of policy direction there if a new administration is elected that has a well-defined strategy for sustainable economic growth and climate change mitigation. But in other parts of the world there seems to be little appetite for letting go of the fossil fuel comfort blanket and taking a brave leap towards sustainability. China has led the way in massive scale implementation of carbon-free technologies like wind, solar, hydro and nuclear over the last few years, but it's still the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, and its response to the COVID-19 crisis has been to regress back to the knee-jerk reaction of opening up more coal mines and relaxing emissions regulations in a short-sighted attempt to safeguard its own economic growth. That decision alone could prove globally catastrophic. Many other countries have good intentions but simply don't have any practical means of investing heavily right now as their national resources are diverted towards just keeping people alive. And this novel coronavirus is far from defeated. In some very notable instances, national responses have been so misguided that the infection rate is still very much on the increase. The widely predicted second wave still needs to be navigated during the latter months of the year as well, so it remains to be seen whether a truly coordinated geopolitical response might actually come into reality as we move towards COP26 in November 2021. The solutions do exist though, and they are achievable if we can, just for once, get some consensus on geopolitical policy and far-sighted, sustainability-focused corporate investment strategy. Quite a bit of food for thought there, I think it's fair to say. Some of the reports I mentioned today are well worth a read if you have time, and I've left links to all of them in the description box below so you can digest them at your leisure. There's lots of debate and opinion, of course, about the best way to get ourselves out of our current global health crisis without losing focus on the ever-worsening climate challenge. So if you do have strong views one way or the other, then jump down to the comments section below and share your thoughts there. That's it for this week though. Thanks to the channel supporters over at Patreon who maintain the channel's independence and make these programmes possible. You can get involved in all that, of course, and get exclusive content and have a chance to influence the channel's direction by visiting www.patreon.com/justhavathink. And you can massively support the channel for free by subscribing and hitting the like button to raise our profile with YouTube's ever-friendly search algorithm. It's dead easy to do that. You just have to click down there somewhere or on that icon there. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you get notified of new content each week. As always, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.